Hello again. In this lecture, we're going to begin looking at the Archaic period, and we'll start looking at Greek architecture. So throughout the Greek history, their sculpture and their pottery illustrates myths and heroes. You've already seen that in the vase with Polyphemus. Architecture is always dedicated to the gods and goddesses, and almost all of their art and sculpture functions within ceremonial architecture and art. And the type of ceremonial architecture they used was called temple. So the different things we're going to look at in the Archaic period are the temple architecture, some temple plans. I'll talk to you about what the architectural orders are, and architectural sculpture. And then in the next lecture, we'll look at freestanding sculpture and vase paintings. So this one is just architecture. Most scholars agree that the Archaic period is the time between 600 and 480 BCE. We have city-states on the mainland, on the Aegean Islands, and the colonies are growing. And during this time, Athens moves to the forefront. It becomes most important. So we have a rapid development of art. We have Aesop and Sappho are writing fables and poems. We have city councils paying commissions to artists. We have potters and vase painters beginning to sign their work. And the city councils commissioned sculpture, temples, government buildings, shrines, and ceramics. And again, I'll say this as many times as I need to, that the hallmark of all budding great cultures is that they are builders. So in the Archaic temple architecture, they begin replacing wood and mud brick with stone and marble. So that early temple model that I showed you that we have the foundation of, most likely made of mud bricks or wood. That's a lot of why it didn't last. These temples that were built here still stand today for the most part, although some are destroyed by bombs in the wars, but for the most part we have them. And so we begin an evolution of standardized plans, and the plans for what's called the elevation of the buildings, the arrangement, proportion, and appearance of what's called the entablature. The entablature is the tall lintel area on the temple. So the elevation is all of the lintel area that's on the front of the temple, and then we have what's called orders of elevations: Doric order, Ionic order, and later Corinthian order. But for the Archaic period, it's Doric and Ionic. So if you understand where these different areas in the temple are, it will help you. That the porch is the covered entrance. The gable is actually the triangular wall space on the end wall between two sides of a pitched roof. And the facade is the front wall of a building. The cella is inside the temple, and the pronaos is usually marked by columns, and it's a vestibule in front. In the last lecture, I showed you plans of the Sanctuary of Apollo. Here's what it looks like now. So again, we don't have a lot of the Sanctuary of Apollo left. It's in the shadow of Mount Parnassus, which is the mountain behind. So here, the god communicated with humans through a woman called the Pythia. So the Pythia was always here. There were lots of different women. She was always called Pythia. And she chewed up sacred laurel, and she drank water from the sacred Cassotis spring, which you saw on the plan. And she would sit over the crevice on a three-legged stool. When she got the god's statement, she would convey it in cryptic form. So the Greeks said many twists of fate were attributed to the misinterpretations of the Pythia's statements. So, you've heard of somebody saying they're very pithy in their remarks, and that's the origin of that. So she might say 3 or 4 words about something, and, people hear what they want to hear, right? So if somebody's coming to say, should I fight this or that city-state? And she says, the sky is blue in Sparta, that either means that they should attack Sparta or they shouldn't attack Sparta, and they will decide for themselves. So if it goes badly, they'll say, well, we misinterpreted, but the Pythia was actually right. So again, the sky is attached to the omphalos of the earth by an umbilical cord, and throughout this entire complex, hundreds of statues are dedicated to the victors in various wars, filling the sanctuary grounds. So the whole thing's built up on a hill. You saw the top of the hill in the previous slide. So you would climb up the lower slopes, and you'd enter down in the lower corner. So that's marked with the number 1. And then you would climb up the sacred way all the way to the colonnade of the temple. So the Temple of Apollo is this large structure in the center, and you'd rest or watch ceremonial dancing on the halos, the pavement. So each structure is separated out. Each particular building has equal importance, and each particular building has its own use. They didn't have multiple uses. They were all about order, so one building for one use. Here's a bronze statue found at the Sanctuary of Apollo, and we think it's from around 477 BC, but nobody's really sure. He would have been standing in a horse-drawn chariot on the top of a monument, and he's bronze, so there aren't that many bronze sculptures, and a lot of that's because if they found the bronze, oftentimes they'd melt it down for something else or make weapons or whatever, so it's just interesting to think of this one. He would have been on top of a monument in a chariot, so people looking at it would have been in a crowd, and he would have been up above their heads. So this diagram labels the different buildings at the sanctuary. So each city had its own treasury, and that's what many of these were, from Athens, from Thebes, Siphonia, Ciconia, Iolia. Each one had its own treasury, and that's where each one kept its own offerings to the god Apollo. Because remember, this whole sanctuary is about Apollo. So there's areas for entertainment, for athletic events, the temple to the god. Most of the buildings are squares or rectangles, and then the entertainment areas are circles or ovals. One building, one function, the need for order and simplicity. So the Greek building styles really don't change a whole lot. You've seen these rectangular buildings, very simple rectilinear plans, functional, easy to realize with the post and lintel construction. I really suggest that you read the architectural orders in your book because it'll familiarize you with the Doric and Ionic orders and the differences between the entablatures. So you want to know what these terms mean and where they are in the buildings. So this, at the top, we see the entablature of the Siphonian treasury at Delphi. Now, these columns are very different than most of the ones you'll see. They're called caryatid columns, which means they're actually sculpted figures that are holding the whole building up itself. So the whole entablature and pediment are carved with relief sculptures. Columns can be carved, although it's unusual. So here is a Doric Archaic temple. This is the Temple of Hera I. It's in Paestum, Italy, actually, interestingly enough, but it is a Greek temple. So it's a really good example of the early form of the Doric order. So it's in the Western Peloponnese, and there was a athletic facility. They had Olympic Games there, just interestingly. This is a post and lintel structure. The peristyle is the row of columns around all 4 sides. This is what's called a peripteral temple. This is a corner of that temple, and so it's a really good slide to help you see the Doric order of columns. So the columns have fluted shafts, and they're resting right on the stylobate. There's no bases on these columns at all. So the capital of the column is the top of the column. The echinus is actually the neck that makes the transition from the shaft of the column, and then the very top of the column has an abacus. That square piece of stone that you see is called the abacus. So the columns are only 4 times as high as their maximum diameter. So they're very, very squat and wide compared to their height. And then they're topped with a very widely flaring capital. So the column shafts rise up, they swell up in the middle and contract toward the top. So this is known again as entasis. And you saw this entasis actually way back in the ziggurats in the ancient Near East, this idea of this curvature that gives it energy and an upward lift or upward motion. If you look at this diagram on the very left and the very right, you can see where they've divided out the column area from the entablature area. So the entablature area is the very top part, and then the column area is the bottom part. And then on the base of it, we have some temples only have a stylobate, some have a stylobate and a stereobate, and some even have a third course, a eurythria, or a leveling course. So when you look at the 2 entablatures, it's slightly different between the Doric and the Ionic as well, although you will see triglyphs and metopes in Ionic temples. The metopes would usually be carved with relief and then painted. So the Doric order of column is very simple. It doesn't have a base. Both of the Ionic and the Corinthian order of columns have a base, and then the tops of them are the main difference that you can really tell. The Doric is very simple. The Ionic has these two flutes, and then the Corinthian order has these rosettes and acanthus leaves. So this slide gives you sort of an evolution of Greek temple plans. So here's our earliest plan that we've been looking at all along on the top left, the Siphnian Treasury, with a very simple cella and a pillar. So remember, all these little black circles are columns. So by the time we get to the Temple of Apollo in Didyma, Turkey, begun around 313, there's many, many columns, and then just a deep cella inside. The Parthenon has, like the Temple of Hera, it has a row of columns all the way around the outside, but all of them have the basic ingredients: the cella, the peristyle of columns or colonnades, the amphithystyle, some of them are a prostyle, some of them have two porches, but they're all just simple rectangles.